Hi, everybody. Sorry, I am a couple of minutes late. I was having some technical issues. I tried to schedule the live stream ahead of time, and YouTube then changed where everything was. And long story. You'll also see that the thumbnail on this video is upside down. It is right side up on my computer, and then when I upload it, YouTube flips it around. So then I went back to my computer. I was like, okay, I'll rotate it and save it upside down. So then I uploaded it that way, and then it was like, no, this is exactly right. So yeah, we'll just pretend that I did it on purpose because the world is turned upside down. So far it looks like I'm still waiting for some people to get here. If there is nobody here, I probably am not going to do this review. So hopefully some people will show up, and they're just trying to figure out where this is on my YouTube channel. So let me just I'm just trying to post the link to this live stream on my YouTube channel for you all. Let's see, is it showing it existing? Okay, I'm sorry that this is all streaming live, and you'll be sad to know that I have not figured out how to edit this all down. That is on my goal for this summer. But let's just get started because it looks like somebody, nope, nobody. I am going to have somebody post to the group chat that if you don't have any questions, I'm going to go about my day. There is a World War I review video. Already on my homepage from last year's review right before the test. So I guess you could just look at that instead. Okay, so I don't know if anybody is here. If there isn't anybody here, I'm going to probably go do something else. I'm mostly here to answer your questions. So if somebody's here, let me know and start asking questions. And if you don't have any questions, I assume you're good to go. And I guess I'll see you at school. I just posted a message to the group chat, so I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for anybody to show up, and then I'm going to go put my kids to bed instead of hanging out with y'all. Rather, not hanging out with y'all. I don't know why the stream would be restricted. Maybe they just restrict all live videos. I'm not sure. Hi, Julia. I'm glad somebody is here. Hooray! So if nobody shows up, you get to ask me whatever you want for the next 55 minutes. What do you want to know about? What do you want me to talk about? I'm just opening some of my notes while you think of questions. Mostly because I want to make sure I don't screw anything up as I'm talking to you. By the way, there are some excellent videos that already exist on the causes of World War I. I know Crash Course on their World History series had like 3, maybe. There's 2 kind of seasons of the World History series. But if you just search Crash Course World War I, there are definitely several videos there. Tom Ritchie also has excellent videos on a lot of European history topics if you guys want to use those for review. So, Julia, any questions, or tell me what you want me to talk about? Okay. Julia said she sent out a message to the seniors group chat and she's digging out her Euro notes. I kind of hoped some of my AP juniors would show up to this, but I don't know how many of them would have seen it on my Twitter feed. Also, my IB juniors could have been here too. But anyway, I'm going to just talk. I'm going to wait until this is right at 8 minutes, and then I'm going to see if I can cut out those first 8 minutes of the video. I'm still messing with that a little bit, and cut out all this extra waiting time. Okay, let's get started. While you guys are looking for your notes and hopefully getting organized here, I'm going to talk a little bit about testing skills in general for history and just some reminders about how to score well on the IB rubric. One of the key things that they're looking for is complexity. So one of the things that I taught you guys to do was to always include because in your thesis. A lot of you choose to ignore that advice. I'm not sure why. Some of you do it in very sophisticated ways, but I would say most of you probably should just use it. You do it. It's a crutch, but do it. The reason I say to use because is a thesis is not just your opinion. I know you've learned that your whole life, but it's also explaining your reasoning. So it's your opinion plus explain your reasoning. So because is kind of the natural connector there. And if you remember to use because, it forces you to explain your reasoning and kind of forces you to think a little deeper. You can do this sometimes with a good although thesis as well, especially if you're asked some sort of historiography question. I think that can be a really sophisticated way to write your thesis. Although Fritz Fischer and others who believe in his line of thinking about or historiographical interpretation about Germans being the primary cause of World War I. Shoot, I forgot the beginning of my sentence. Although Fritz Fischer and others in his school of thinking blame Germany for the outbreak of World War I, the causes are much more complex because it's a combination of nationalism, alliances, and I don't know what else you would want to say, imperialism that lead to the outbreak of war. That is framing your thesis within the frame of a historiographical debate. And I think that that's a really wise way to start. Now, for those of you who were here for the French Revolution live review, I believe I did share last year on Schoology, and I sent it again to Mr. Hawley and asked him to share it with you guys. Overview of French Revolution historiography that's similar to the World War I historiography articles that we read. It was a little bit complex for you guys to read in the fall. I think you had to have at least some understanding of Marx to understand it. But I think that it's only like 2 or 3 pages, and it would give you really good footing for that if you want to glance over that now. Okay, so talking about World War I in general, before we get into the causes, I want to talk a little bit about the diplomacy that led to World War I, because the World War I question or section on the IB exam actually refers to that whole period between the unification of Germany and the outbreak of World War I. So that means that you need to think about what happens not just in 1914, but what happens in kind of the 30 years before. So unification of Germany is a big part of that, right? The unification of Germany completely disrupts the balance of power in Central Europe, which had been so important at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. That would be a great piece of context, which is a specific point on the AP exam. But on the IB exam, I think also just helps to kind of complicate your thesis and think about long-term causes of things. So the diplomacy after 1870, which is kind of at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, you're really starting with the unification of Germany in this time period. The topic is European diplomacy in the First World War, 1870 to 1923. So they're having you look at how diplomacy was screwed up by the balance of power shift with the unification of Germany. You could think of German unification in January of 1871 happening in the Hall of Mirrors at the Treaty of Versailles, in the most French, amazing room in France. The Germans create their empire, right? Which is a total slap in the face to the French. And then it, of course, makes sense that the Treaty of Versailles will happen at Versailles, that they will force the Germans back to that place where they had been slapped in the face. And the French are the ones who will push for the harshest indemnities, led by Georges Clemenceau at the Congress of Vienna, will push for the harshest indemnities against the Germans and really be the driving force between Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, which blames the Germans for the outbreak of the war. Thinking also back to the 1870s, you can look at the Berlin Conference, which is a little bit before, the conference itself isn't before, but imperialism starts, I think, a little bit before 1870. But the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85 is really meant to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, in the scramble for Africa. And also is really a marker of Germany's kind of emergence as an imperial power. The other thing that we talked about with Germany was their place in the sun. Wilhelm II gave a speech in the first Moroccan crisis, talking about how Germany deserved a place in the sun and how their future lay on the water. In other words, they needed a navy to support their imperial goals. They needed that navy to protect their interests abroad. And really, they needed that navy to challenge Britain. Britain had the most powerful navy in the world. This is going to lead to the naval race between Britain and Germany. You guys should have some stats in your notes about how much German defense spending had increased in those years, especially the last 4 years right before the war. Germany was really ramping up their production. And that was one of our causes of World War I, too, was militarism. So the acronym that I taught you guys to remember the causes of the war, you probably remember MAIN, but we complicated that a little bit and talked about IMANIC. So the first I is imperialism. The next letter is M, which is militarism. The next letter is A, which is alliances. The next letter is N, which is nationalism. Then industrialization and a culture of violence. So starting with imperialism, just a real quick overview. There was a lot of conflict between Britain and France. But how is that a cause of World War I? They're on the same side, right? Well, part of how it's a cause is that this natural animosity between France and Britain had to be resolved before they could become allies, right? So with Germany becoming this new big powerhouse in Central Europe, they are looking for alliances because they're worried about the French seeking revenge. So their goal, the German foreign policy goal, was to isolate France and to look for other alliances. So Germany, for instance, had this reinsurance treaty with Russia, which will lapse after Bismarck is fired in 1890. So that also fits in that time period. Bismarck is fired well before the outbreak of the war, but that's an important long-term cause of the war because he was kind of this master juggler who was keeping all these alliances up in the air. And that's going to fall apart when he's no longer there to manage it. We talked about the series of poor choices that Wilhelm II made in terms of choosing Bismarck's replacement, that they wanted to, he wanted to replace Bismarck with somebody a little bit less powerful and a little bit less able to challenge him. Going back to imperialism, though, Wilhelm's Weltpolitik, Weltpolitik, is basically trying to get Germany to have a piece of Africa, to have a piece of this kind of carving up of the rest of the world that France and Britain were partaking in. Britain having the north to south corridor, kind of the Cape to Cairo Railroad, the Belgian Congo in the center. We talked about a lot of atrocities there, about a lot of atrocities of Britain and South Africa, the Boer War there, and then France's kind of north-south strip, with Britain and France kind of then colliding at the Fashoda crisis, but figuring out how to resolve that diplomatically. So what you see in imperialism is France and Britain drawing closer together and clashing more and more with Germany. So that's really setting up those two sides, right? Hold on just one second. It's also demonstrating the idea that they see the people that they colonize as just sort of pawns in the game, right? Which I think Lenin would agree with that interpretation of imperialism. He said that imperialism was just capitalists sort of exploiting the rest of the world, and that the war was capitalists exploiting the workers, that they were fighting a capitalist war over resources. So that's how I would frame imperialism as a cause of World War I. The M then is militarism. Well, to support all this imperial goals, they had the naval race. They had this massive buildup of arms. That's going to create tension because Britain and Germany are going to be kind of like racing to really an arms race. The dreadnoughts were the ships that we talked about in that respect. And then alliances, you've got, this is a little bit confusing. We talked about trying to sort this out. The Central Powers on one hand and the Allies on the other hand, but the Central Powers, their alliance is called the Triple Alliance, and the Allies, which you would think would be Triple Alliance but is not, is the Triple Entente. The Entente Cordiale being between France and Britain, and then the Anglo-Russian alliance between England and Russia. And you guys read an article about that, so I would definitely go back and review your annotations. This is where these annotations really pay off if you've done a good job. The annotations can really, if you've done a good job on them, just reading them can be much faster than rereading the articles. I would look at the Anglo-Russian Entente. I would look at Caprivi, Hohenlohe, Kaiser Wilhelm II, those two Massey articles. I'm trying to think what other World War I articles we had. Those are the ones that I can think of that relate to the causes. Okay, so, and then nationalism is kind of driving a lot of this, right? So if they were to ask you a question like, to what extent did nationalism cause World War I? You could say something like, you don't have to say, well, nationalism was one cause, but imperialism and militarism were another cause. You could say something even more sophisticated, like, there were many causes of World War I, although actually I don't love that. It's a little vague. Nationalism is an important cause of World War I because it drives all of the other causes. It's the force behind imperialism, behind militarism, behind maybe even industrialization, because industrialization is about competing for markets and resources. And so the imperial drive is part of that. And then I forgot to mention the Central Powers were Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. But Austria-Hungary was a weaker power in that sense. And then Italy, of course, would switch sides with the Treaty of London in 1915. The Ottoman Empire would join the not join the Triple Alliance, but would join the Central Powers, as would Bulgaria. And then with the Allies, it's France, Britain, Russia. Serbia gets, because it all kind of starts there, and Russia is protecting Serbia, which is another way that nationalism is a cause of World War I, that Russia, because of Pan-Slavism, sees themselves as the protector of all Slavs. Serbia, because of Pan-Slavism, is trying to protect Serbs in Bosnia, which had been annexed by Austria, which was really only available because the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. So that whole Balkan region went up for grabs, which then caused conflict between Austria and Russia. So hopefully this is kind of sparking some of your memories about this. I do see your questions over there, guys. I'm just going to kind of finish my overview and then I'll get to your specific questions. So nationalism, I think, is a really key cause. Germans into Nazis talks about this quite a lot. And I just want to clarify, if you're talking about the August days, if you remember those spontaneous parades in Germany in 1914, it's after the war broke out, right? So how do you talk about the August days as a cause of the war? You just have to be specific about it and explain your thinking. Well, the August days are a reflection of pre-existing nationalism, right? They were excited for war. They had these spontaneous parades demonstrating their war enthusiasm because they already felt very nationalistic. Now, the other thing that I would say about that, though, is to kind of up your analytical game, there's lots of perspectives on that. One of the historiography articles mentioned in the overview that we read said that he kind of questions how much enthusiasm there was. He questions the number of volunteers that Germany had. And Fritzsche, who we read, the Germans into Nazis article or chapter, talks about all the socialists who didn't show up, right? So that the socialists were in Germany not enthusiastic for the war, and that there were political divisions there. So that's how you want to up that analytical game. You don't want to just talk about Germany wanted. Germany doesn't want anything. Germany's a country. The people in Germany wanted things, and different groups of people wanted different things, right? So understanding the complexity of those perspectives, that's how you deepen your analysis. Remember those history words that are in bold on your old rubrics: perspective, causation, effect, significance. All of those are kind of historical thinking skills, and you just use those words. Now, you're not going to have them right there. You have to remember what they are, but use those words to help you deepen your thinking. Trying to remember which Imanic thing I left off. A-M-A-N-I. Oh, industrialization. Industrialization as a cause of the war, you have to be a little bit careful of. I think industrialization drove imperialism. I think that because of industrialization, they were looking for more raw materials in imperial markets, which is causing tension between countries. I think that they're competing for markets and raw materials. I also mentioned machine guns and barbed wire, which didn't cause the war, but caused the nature of the war, right? It meant that instead of a quick and dirty war, as the Franco-Prussian War had been, it wasn't that fast, but it was much faster than World War I was and much less destructive. Barbed wire and machine guns are really going to lead to trenches on the Western Front and make that much more terrible than it had been, 40 years before. And then the culture of violence, we talked about dueling, right? And a willingness to go to war, an excitement to go to war, that war enthusiasm, which you could talk about in some sophisticated ways. So those are the causes. I think that if you really understand those causes, you want to really remember a couple of specific examples under each idea, but there's overlap there, right? So you're not going to write a paragraph that uses all 6 of those causes of World War I. But you want to make sure that you've got like a good 9 to 10 pieces of evidence for each cause in your brain with lots of specificity. And you want to know a couple of historians for historiography purposes, if you can work it in. You can't just name drop, though. You can't say Fritzsche argues that blah, blah, blah. You have to use what he says and react to it and analyze it in your essay and explain why you do or do not agree with it. You can also get the perspective kind of credit if you're really thinking about how different groups within the countries supported or didn't support the war. Then we have the Archduke's assassination. We talked about that a lot. I'm not sure I really need to go over that. Just want to remind you of the July crisis that we acted out in class, because I think that really helped you to understand those are different perspectives too, right? Serbia, of course, they're not going to let Austria conduct this investigation in their country because that would be a violation of their sovereignty. And of course, Austria wants to because it was their heir who was assassinated. And there was some evidence that the Serbian government was at least knew that this was kind of being planned, if not outright supporting it. And then, of course, Russia would support the Serbs because they see themselves, excuse me again, sorry, allergy season. They see themselves as the protector of Slavic peoples. They then feel pressured into supporting the Slavs when Germany issues the blank check. The blank check is an important idea there because that's Germany backing up their ally, right? So again, alliances causing the war, but also really kind of a case of German aggression. And that's where that debate about whether or not Germany was responsible for the war comes into it. Okay, so course of the war, you want to remember a couple of the big battles. The first Battle of the Marne is the very first one where they really get entrenched. The Battle of the Somme is the single bloodiest battle of the war. You guys did the kind of virtual tour that I put together for you in class. You could look over that assignment even on your Google Drive just to remind yourself of some of those details of the Battle of the Somme and how terrible it was, how poorly handled it was. You would want to look at some of the technology used in the war, and that was developed during the war. So I already mentioned barbed wire really trapping people up in the making the trenches very hard, or the no man's land very hard to cross. Machine guns are a huge deal. During the course of the war, tanks will be experimented with and used for the first time really kind of on a larger scale in the Battle of the Somme. They're not super effective at first, but by the end of the war, I would say they have an impact. Chlorine gas, mustard gas, phosphine gas, the invention of gas masks, the use of airplanes first for surveillance and then for dogfighting, how, kind of poorly, how badly that went at first. Those are the technologies that I can think of. There's also some medical advancements, the use of prosthetics after the war, blood transfusions kind of figured out during the war. There's usually medical advancements during war. You could talk about the nature of the war, how it was very different on the Western Front than on the Eastern Front. So on the Western Front, it's very entrenched, right? It's a war of attrition is the phrase that we used. So it's a war with no offense. It's primarily defensive because there was no offense, right? You go over the top, you die. Like that's how it was. Those big artillery shells were so loud at the Battle of the Somme, they could hear them all the way across the English Channel. So the Somme is like here, they could hear them all the way over there. Gosh, I can't think of other technologies. Let me know if you have any questions about other technologies or if you think of something. Oh, and then so the Western Front is very entrenched, right? It's very static. There's very little movement. Even the Battle of the Somme, they just move forward very short distance to what they call, I think, the Hindenburg line. But then the Germans will eventually push them back. So how did the Allies eventually win the war? Well, you've got a lot of things happening. First off, the Russians had their little revolution. So the Germans are able to direct all of their attention then after 1917 to the Western Front. There was also a Southern Front, Italy fighting on skis against Austria and things like that. And then also in Turkey, the Battle of Gallipoli. You would think that would give the Germans an advantage, right? But what else happened in 1917? Well, unrestricted submarine warfare, that's something I should have mentioned for technology, was the U-boats, meant that Germans were shooting down every ship across the Atlantic. The U.S. was supporting Britain, and they didn't want contraband being brought into Allied countries. There were a lot of financial interests of Americans in Britain. So when the Lusitania is shot down, that's not an immediate cause of the war. That's in 1915. The U.S. doesn't join until 1917. The Lusitania and the Sussex will lead to the Sussex Pledge, where basically Germany says, we're going to not shoot everything down, okay? But by 1917, things have gotten so bad in Germany because of the British blockade. The British blockade is key. The British have boats all the way around Germany, all the way around in the North Sea. And that's keeping goods from getting into Germany, which means that basically the Germans are starving. The number of calories that the average German is eating by the end of the war is something like 900 calories a day. They had the turnip winter. They had the butter strike in Berlin, which I think we talked about, which was basically a massive butter shortage. They're desperate for calories. They're desperate for fat. That's why they have this butter riot. I guess it's strike, butter riot. So that's really restricting not just German morale, but also like production, like steel and things like that aren't coming into Germany to produce weapons. The German is the Ludendorff and Hindenburg are controlling the German economy, so German war socialism. It's still not enough. Even though they're making all of these decisions for the good of the war effort, it's not enough to keep Germany alive. Austria at this point is kind of it's nothing compared to the German war machine. It doesn't have the industrial power. They're not able to produce the same number of soldiers, same number of guns. It's a really big deal that Germany is basically fighting alone. And then the Americans join, right? So the Zimmermann telegram is kind of the last straw. The Germans send a telegram to the Mexican ambassador saying, hey, if you join the war, we'll give you these huge chunks of the southern parts of the U.S. that you had lost in previous wars with the U.S., and in exchange, we need you to declare war on the United States. The U.S. intercepts this telegram. So spying, I think, is a key point there too. Some of you did your IA presentations on spying, I think. You could use those details in an essay. That's making them want to join the war against Germany. There probably already was a desire for that already. But after the Zimmermann telegram, they're going to support it even more. So that's, I think, the biggest reason that the Germans lose the war is the British blockade, and then the Americans bringing in fresh troops, fresh supplies, fresh energy into the war. So Julia asked me to review the Sonderweg theory and the counter-argument and how that relates with post-unification, pre-World War I Germany. So the Sonderweg, if you remember, means special path. And that was Wehler's argument that Germany kind of went wrong, that Germany did not have a liberal tradition, that Germany basically craved authoritarian rule. I don't know that it relates that much to pre-World War I Germany. I usually use this to talk about Bismarck's rule. I think you can use it also to talk about the rise of the Nazis. It's a good historiographical argument for that. Jeff Ely argues against Wehler and says that Germany didn't take a special path, that there was actually quite a bit of liberal development in Germany, despite the fact that it had a semi-authoritarian dictatorship. So Wehler had called that a Bonapartist dictatorship with a sort of charismatic authoritarian rule of Bismarck. You could use that, though, to talk about the rise of the Nazis. Chidi asked for me to explain the reasons for tensions between the countries. For the Anglo-German tensions, I think the naval race is a big one. Remember that Wilhelm II is a grandson of Queen Victoria, has a strong admiration for the British Navy, had grown up on the Isle of Man playing in this play, I don't know, war ground that they had for them, playing with, they would flood it and they could man these boats around it. So he'd been obsessed with navies for a long time, and he really wanted Germany's navy to match the glory and size of the British Navy. So that's one tension, because that's seen as a challenge to Britain. The first and second Moroccan crisis. So here is France, right? And then Morocco is right here in Africa. It's hard to do this backwards. The Moroccan crisis, basically there was a uprising against French control in Morocco. The Germans will support those revolters, and Britain will pledge their this is after the Fashoda crisis, by the way, so they've overcome that tension. Britain will pledge their support to the French. In the second Moroccan crisis, they actually send ships, which means that that friendly understanding isn't just a friendly understanding, that's an alliance, right? We're not just going to back it up with like, yeah, we got you. We're going to actually back it up by sending ships. So I think that that's an important turning point in French-German relationships. Anglo-German tensions too. Germany just really felt left out of the situation in Africa, that they had gotten kind of the raw stick. Any other questions here? If you guys don't have any other questions, I probably will just talk real quickly about the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace treaties, and then wish you good night. I do want to mention, we talked about the new course, that one of those articles you read last year was the new course, which is that change in German foreign policy, which is really the switch to kind of this global colonial rivalry, that the Weltpolitik. Oh, one thing I haven't talked about was the effects of the war on the civilian population. You could talk about how so many women start working in factories to support the war effort, the volunteer efforts in all countries, the DORA Act, the Defense of the Realm Act in Britain, was really meant to rally support for the war. The propaganda that's used on all sides to get people to support the war, the bond selling efforts. So they basically sell bonds, which are investments that people can make, but it's basically a way to lend the government money to support the war effort. And there's a lot of propaganda encouraging people to buy bonds. Politically, it makes women more independent. It makes them, the fight for suffrage, which had gone on before the war, is going to kind of get tempered a little during the war because they were at war. But in shortly after the war, women will be granted suffrage. So I think that's a big shift. Women are really involved in the war in nursing, in volunteering, in factories. I'm trying to. Those are the big things I can think of. Oh, in Germany, really involved in politically in like the butter riots. That's basically women rioting for more food. That's destabilizing in Germany. That's part of why when the Kiel uprising happens in November of 1918, when those naval soldiers refuse to follow orders, why Germany is so ripe to explode into revolution. Factors leading to the defeat of Germany and the other Central Powers. For Germany, we talked about the shortages and the blockade already. For Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand dies, not Franz Ferdinand, I'm sorry, Franz Josef, the Austrian emperor, dies in the middle of the war. For the Ottoman Empire, we talked about Lawrence of Arabia being sent by the British into the Ottoman Empire to encourage an Arab revolt. We didn't really talk about Bulgaria. I just don't think they're a very strong ally. Strategic errors. I think the Zimmerman telegram is probably an error. The shortages, the United States, I mentioned already, but how that's going to bring this kind of influx of money and guns and people into the war. The Battle of Argonne Forest, by the way, is the big battle that the United States is really able to kind of push the Germans back. The post-war peace treaties and their territorial, political, and economic effects on Europe. There's a different treaty. So Versailles is the treaty made between Germany and the Allies. Article 231, the German war guilt clause, is, I think, a really important piece of that. There's also restrictions on their militarization. You probably learned more of these details in The Rise of the Nazis, right? That they couldn't have troops in the Rhineland, that there were limits on the size of their military, that they were not allowed to unite with Austria, which was another German country. And then there's separate peace treaties with each of the other belligerent powers. So the Treaty of Saint-Germain, the Treaty of Trianon, Neuilly, and then Sèvres-Lausanne. Long-term impact of that is, of course, the rise of nationalism and this kind of feeling of German resentment. The most important terms of the Paris Peace Conference. I think the biggest thing, like I said, is the German war guilt clause. The Soviet Union, by the way, separate peace treaty. You would also want to remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans. Russia gives up these huge chunks of, what are now Estonia, parts of what's now Lithuania, the Ukraine, the Crimea. They give up huge chunks to the Germans in March of 1918. The Bolsheviks signed that. But then, of course, the Germans lose the war anyway. And so Russia is eventually going to get some of that. The Soviet Union will get some of that territory back. The armistice is November 11th, 1918. That's the end of the fighting. But the peace treaty is not signed until 1919. It's the end of four big empires, right? The Habsburg Empire collapses. The Ottoman Empire in the Ottoman Empire collapses. The Hohenzollern Empire dynasty in Prussia collapses, and the Romanov dynasty in Russia collapses. So Austrians, Ottomans, Prussians, and Russians, all those empires won't survive the war. They were multi-ethnic empires. If you remember the Armenian genocide in the middle of the war, you've got infighting between different groups in the Ottoman Empire. It was going to be hard for those empires to survive once nationalism existed anyway, but the war just kind of pushes them over the edge. The big three, really the big four, but it's kind of three that were the big players. Woodrow Wilson from the US, Georges Clemenceau, and then David Lloyd George is the socialist ruler of, or Prime Minister of England. Georges Clemenceau is the president of France. The defeated powers were not invited to the Paris Peace Conference. Vittorio Orlando was also there of Italy. He's the fourth one. Russia was not invited either because the Russians were in the middle of a civil war. It took 6 months for them to hammer out the details of the treaty with Germany, and then the treaties with Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria would follow. Turkey by then was what had become the Ottoman Empire had become Turkey. It signed in June 28th, 1919 by the Weimar government in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. That treaty, or I'm sorry, the Weimar government had been reformed after the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. And of course, that's going to cause them legitimacy problems because of the stab in the back theory under the fascists. A lot of really unrealistic requirements for reparations really angers the German people, helps contribute to the economic depression that's going to affect all of Europe. And it really didn't resolve any of the reasons for the conflict anyway. Germany had to give up Alsace-Lorraine, which, if you remember, it had won in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. So they gave it back to France. In 1914, France had yelled, going to the front, do it for Alsace, and now they get it back, right? The Sudetenland goes to Czechoslovakia, which becomes independent. The Polish corridor goes to Poland, which becomes independent. Of course, that's going to be both of those regions will be contested by Hitler. The Rhineland is demilitarized. The Saarland, the coal region, will be under international control for 15 years. Germany was limited to 100,000 army troops. They weren't allowed any reserves, tanks, aircrafts, warships, or submarines. They had to pay $5 billion in immediate reparations, and then sort of with a promise that more reparations were to come. It was meant to be the war to end all wars, this lasting peace, but instead it was designed to make Germany suffer. Being stripped of any army, having to get up huge chunks of territory, and then the reparations were just crippling to the German economy. In total, they were expected to pay over $33 billion in reparations, which was impossible, especially when you consider how devastated they were by the war. Wilson's 14 points we talked about, we'll just let you guys Google those, but they're basically about sort of democracy. He wanted a peace without victory, but really that is really countered by Clemenceau. The French in particular had suffered, which, so much fighting had happened on their territory. It makes sense that they wanted money to rebuild all of that. But that is not going to be, Wilson's 14 points are not going to be wholly followed. It's like self-determination, open diplomacy, like some of them were, but some of them weren't. They do create a League of Nations. But unfortunately, Wilson loses the election, and the U.S. Senate never joins the League of Nations, which makes it ineffective because the U.S. really comes out of the war as a superpower and will never join the League. The League of Nations didn't have any kind of military either, so they couldn't enforce things that they suggested. A lot of senators objected to the Versailles Treaty, and they never did ratify it because of the League of Nations. They were worried that it committed America to involvement abroad and then undermined their sovereignty. In 1921, the U.S. eventually signed separate treaties with the belligerent powers. I talked about the quote, lost but not forgotten land, the idea that the Germans really felt that they had lost these territories, the Polish corridor, Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, that they'd lost but not forgotten those territories. And we'll see Hitler, of course, come back to claim them later. There's somewhere around 10 million deaths in World War I, another 50 million wounded, another 2 million suicides. And the war is incredibly expensive. Just to kind of leave you with a sobering thought here, in 1918, the $4 billion that the war cost was enough to build and furnish a 5-room house on 5 acres of land for every family in the US, Canada, Australia, England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, France, Belgium, Germany, and Russia. And it could have also provided a library, hospital, park, and university for every town over 20,000 and paid the salaries of 125 billion teachers, nurses, firemen, and policemen. Well into the 21st century, by the way. There's food shortages and economic depression, a lot of refugees, a lot of ethnic minorities sort of feeling like they should be moving to another area. So a lot of dislocation. Austria-Hungary is divided into Austria-Hungary. Czechoslovakia is made independent. Yugoslavia is made independent. Poland's made independent. And then Romania and Italy got other portions. The Sykes-Picot Agreement talked about spheres of influence in the Middle East, which is going to be very disruptive in the Middle East. The Balfour Declaration we talked about, basically saying that the British supported the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Most Arab states opposed that. But when, although they had been promised Arab independence, like that was part of what Lawrence of Arabia had brought to Arab leaders in the Ottoman Empire. And even though they showed up at the Paris Peace Conference, and Lawrence of Arabia was there as well, they were not given that. And then, a rise of extremism in Germany, in Italy, this return to isolationism, extreme isolation in the United States. Yeah. How did Italy fare in World War I? That's a good question. You would think that, and I assume you're thinking of this because of the rise of fascism, Italy was not nearly as devastated as Germany. Basically, though, they didn't feel like they got as much as they deserved. There certainly was suffering. The fighting up in the Alps. I'm trying to remember which specific battle we talked about. Caporetto, Battle of Caporetto. It is destructive, and the Italians lose a lot. They're given Sud Tirol, which basically is kind of this little northern part here from Austria. They feel like they don't get what they deserve. They feel like they don't get enough. So the rise of fascism in Italy, which it starts there before it starts in Germany, is less about this kind of stab in the back idea than it is in Germany, but more that like we didn't get our peace. I would say the rise of fascism is in Italy is maybe more about kind of completing Italian unification and Italian nationalism, which is probably a little bit true in Germany too. And I don't recall. You would have to look, Julia, at the Treaty of London. That's a good question to Google. I know they were promised territories. I think Sud Tirol was part of it. I don't know if there were specific territories that they were promised that they didn't get. That's possible, especially along like the coast here of the Adriatic, that became part of Yugoslavia and not part of Italy. But I don't recall the specifics there. So do you guys have any other questions? All two of you? If you guys could get more people in here, they would ask a lot more questions, and then that would probably be more useful for you all. I feel like I'm doing a review so far for 4 people. So I'm going to plan on doing one more live review on Saturday afternoon, and I will post details of that on Twitter. And if you subscribe to my channel, I will also schedule the live review. It's going to be during the day. The State History Day competition is on Saturday, so I'm hoping I can kind of squeeze it in then. But I'm probably looking at 12:30 to 1:30 is what I'm thinking on Saturday. But spread the word that if people don't show up, I'm just going to click in and click out. I got lots of stuff to do. I got lots of IAs to grade. So, all right. If you guys don't have any other questions, I will say goodnight. Any last questions before I go? Do review that World War I historiography. I think both of you could really benefit from that. Really help you up your analytical game. Okay. If you can frame your whole essay in terms of what different historians thought, wow, that'd be amazing. I think some weaknesses in terms of what we covered would be, we talked about the home front, but you could remember some more specifics from like maybe a little bit from Germany, a little bit from France, a little bit from Britain, and not just talk in general terms about women, but how were British women different than German women. The butter riots are a good example of that. The food shortages were more extreme in Germany. And then maybe some of like the military, we talked about the Battle of the Somme a lot, but less about Gallipoli and kind of these larger military things, but they don't tend to ask about military history. It would be more like analyze the nature of war in World War I. You could talk about trench warfare on the West and, movement in the East and the weaknesses of the Russian army facing the German army. So if you guys don't have any more questions, I'm going to end it there. And good luck, you guys. You bet, Julia. Julia, I never see you. I think I've seen you like twice this year. So come say hi sometime and let me know what's going on. I don't even know what's happening next year with you. Cheetah, you too. I haven't seen you in ages. So good luck, guys. And, get some rest this weekend. If you don't know by now, how much can you cram in a weekend? Make sure you're going to your exams well rested and with lots of extra pens, and a watch is good too. So have a good weekend, guys.